Sharon Osbourne and cancel culture. So this became kind of an interesting episode of canceling, because it really kind of turned out that the person that you would least expect to get canceled was the person who ended up getting canceled. There could have been a number of different people that could have been actually attacked here, but it turned out to be the last one, basically maybe the last one who had anything to really say on the issue. But to go back, on March 7th of this past year, Prince Harry, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, and Oprah Winfrey had a 2-hour interview, ostensibly about why Harry and Meghan had moved to the United States, what was going on inside the royal family that prompted that, a discussion about their child, also and it ended up there being an announcement about the pregnancy, and so it was kind of a how are things going, and can you dish us a little dirt, kind of thing. During the course of the interview, which was kind of dominated by Meghan, although Harry did provide some information about his relationship with his father and his brother and his grandparents at the time, but mostly it was kind of Meghan and Oprah. Meghan had revealed that there had been at least some member of the royal family, didn't mention who or how many, that were kind of concerned about the fact that their children were multiracial. Harry then later in the interview confirmed that concern, although didn't go any further than that. And of course, as you can kind of imagine, that turned out to be the bombshell of the interview. Everything else that could be talked about in that interview, including the fact that both Meghan and really Harry would have liked to have had some intervention in terms of mental health. They were suffering from serious anxiety problems and so forth, and they and the royal family basically shot that down, kind of because of optics and so on. That kind of was secondary to the fact that we had this this racial thing. And so the interview airs 8 to 10 on Sunday night, which means that if you were able to watch it in Great Britain, you were watching it from 2 to 4 in the morning. But that didn't stop Good Morning Britain on ITV from talking about the interview the next morning. And one of the co-hosts of Good Morning Britain is Piers Morgan, who's been a news personality in both Great Britain and the United States for a number of years. And Piers is not what you would call a wallflower. He says his opinions, and he says them pretty bluntly. And here's a picture of Piers Morgan in action, and his long-suffering co-hostess Susanna Reid. Piers was having none of this stuff from Harry and Meghan. It was appalled that they would bring that up, particularly since at the time Prince Philip had been in the hospital, and this was just prior, maybe a month or so before Prince Philip actually ended up passing away. So but he there's a little background. Piers Morgan used to kind of praise Meghan, and then she kind of blew him off a few times, and so he became kind of her she was in his crosshairs, and he was turned very much against her. And he said that she made up the entire story about the reference to, multiracial children, and the fact that the royal family was not into providing a mental health. This was before even it had seen, before anybody in Great Britain had, seen the entire interview, which aired later that night. The next morning, he was still just, going after Harry and Meghan, and he was talking with one of the people who are on Good Morning Britain, Alex Beresford, and Beresford was, saying that, Piers was overreacting, and that, it wasn't a good look for Piers. And about 2 minutes into that, Piers Morgan, as you can see here, got up and stormed off the set. Later that afternoon, the management at ITV asked Morgan if to go on the air the next morning and apologize to Meghan for doubting her story. Morgan refused. Within a couple of hours, they had negotiated an exit. And so I don't know how much money that he ended up leaving with, but he was no longer, being employed by ITV. We'll catch up with his fate in a little bit. Back later that afternoon, I don't know how many people have ever watched The Talk, but it's a show that's on CBS. I believe it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It features a rotating group of 4 to 5 women, depending on the season. And, there have probably been a total of maybe 12 women in the course of the decade that the show has been on that have served as hostesses. One of the people that had been, I think it's been on almost since its inception, has been Sharon Osbourne, who, of course, comes from the United Kingdom, is, among other things, the husband of Ozzy Osbourne, but is, kind of a very successful business person in her own right. Osbourne, that same Tuesday that Morgan ended up storming off Good Morning Britain, tweeted, about Piers, who has been a longtime friend of hers. "I'm with you. I stand by you. People forget that you're paid for your opinion and just speaking your truth." That engendered, a lot of social media pushback. So the next day on the show, she went and defended the tweet that she made, and saying that she was just defending a friend. Cheryl Underwood, who was fellow co-host, African-American woman, then asked Osbourne, basically, when you're standing by your friend, you're kind of giving him validation, or giving validation to what he has to say, and that it might be perceived as being racist, even if you don't agree. That kind of, in addition to Osbourne feeling, attacked anyway, because of, the kind of pushback on her tweet, then, kind of really got ruffled and said that she didn't find it fair that just because of her friendship with Piers, that she could be accused of racism. And, she felt that she was being singled out. "I'm about to be put into the electric chair because I have a friend who many people think is a racist. So that makes me racist. What does it have to do with me? How could I be racist about anything or anybody?" It was about to get a little bit worse. At that point, the show went to the commercial, but not before Osbourne just went off on an expletive laden rant, and he got some of the the more powerful ones in. If producers thought that going to a commercial was going to help, they were wrong. Osbourne demanded that Underwood defend her claims against Morgan, adding, "Don't try and cry, because if anybody should be crying, it should be me." Underwood, I guess, has kind of a little bit of a history of being very emotional, and so Osbourne was using that against her. Underwood then explained it was not the exact words of racism, it's the implications and reaction to it. And I put that in red myself because that's kind of at the crux of things, is that, there wasn't anything that was being specifically said that was racist. It was the kind of implications of the defense of, somebody who, didn't believe, Megan, that somehow that was racist, and also kind of dismissing what a Black woman had to say about it.
Rod, you have 4 minutes.
Okay, and that's all I'll need. And so, anyway, there's a picture of Osbourne and Underwood. Underwood further explained that she and the other co-hosts were not accusing Osbourne of being racist. Right now, I'm talking to a woman who I believe is my friend. I don't want anybody to watch this and say they're attacking you for being racist. Osbourne, of course, took that very well and said, it's too late. I think the seed's already been sowed. It was almost at the end of the time of the show anyway. So basically that ended it. After the program, CBS announced the talk would go on hiatus, which means that it was going to shut down production for a while. It resumed production 2 weeks later, but without Osbourne, as she and CBS reached settlement on her contract. Osbourne had apologized, and it seemed to be, the kind of apology that William Benoit would say is, a great example of mortification. I'm sorry, I panicked, I got defensive, and so forth. She, clearly owned it. But it didn't do any good with CBS. They made a statement that we concluded Sharon's behavior toward her host did not align with our values of a respectful workplace. And in case fans didn't get it, the first episode of the talk, when it returned, was largely an attack, a review of the episode, and largely an attack against Sharon Osbourne. So a couple of points here. This all started with an interview featuring two members of the royal family and the premier celebrity interviewer in the United States. Discussion then broadened to two outspoken British TV personalities. The interview contained information that members of the royal family harbored racist thoughts concerning another member of the royal family. This was the kind of content that kind of is a minefield that you have to be very, very careful in this day and age, and in order to navigate. And if you don't, navigate it well, somebody's going to get canceled. Harry, Meghan, Piers, Sharon Osbourne. Oprah, of course, is not going to get canceled, but somebody was. And then, in this particular case, it turned out to be Sharon Osbourne. She and in some respects probably had the least connection to what the original controversy was all about. She got canceled because she defended somebody who was being, whose objection was being perceived as being racist. Not because it wasn't her making judgments about the royal family. It wasn't, her making judgments about, Harry and Meghan's daughter. It was, I'm defending my friend, and in defending her friend, she was the one that ended up getting canceled, lost her job, and so far has not had any other subsequent employment. Piers, on the other hand, he's going to Fox News, and he'll be appearing probably sometime next spring. So check your local listings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rod. Okay, let's give Rod a round of applause. And our next presenter is our colleague from a cold place called Canada, Michael Dudley, from University of Winnipeg.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's actually not that cold today, but yeah, in the winter we can go down to -40. So there you go. Oh, that's Celsius, of course. Anyway, academic freedom, cancel culture, and the Shakespeare authorship question. So my talk is about character assassination coming from an elite level, elite institutions, universities, and the mass media, who call upon scholars for input. I'm going to briefly introduce the Shakespeare authorship question because it is something that in the popular consciousness has a very poor reputation. It's widely thought of as a conspiracy theory that's ridiculous. And that's because the campaign against it has been very successful. I'm going to be looking at orthodox mainstream rhetoric and scholarly practices regarding the authorship question, specifically the role of ethos and pathos in suppressing the authorship question. And those are rhetorical modes of persuasion I'll get to in a second. Looking at asserted conviction regarding the Shakespeare of tradition, not simply as an assertion of an historical fact, but it's actually a belief system and a model of what I'm calling a juridical belief system, for lack of a better word, that can help us, I think, understand some of the doxastic or belief aspects that are rooted in beliefs that help fuel cancel culture. And then I'd like to wrap up with some thoughts about how we can work towards ethical inquiry and debate in the academy without character assassination. The presentation is based on a chapter I wrote in a book. It was published in November 2020 in the book Teaching and Learning Practices for Academic Freedom. And first, some terminology. When I'm going to be talking about Shakespeare, I'm referring to the author of the poems and plays, whomever he was. I'm not making any statement about who I think the author was. Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, is the Stratford-upon-Avon businessman, theater investor, and perhaps part-time actor for whom we have historical records, but none of those records relate to literature at all. Stratfordian is the tradition that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, and people who hold that belief are also called Stratfordians. Anti-Stratfordians or post-Stratfordians, full disclosure, like myself, believe that the tradition has no basis in historical evidence and that someone else must have been the author. They may not necessarily have a candidate in mind. And then there are those who are partisan for candidates like the Earl of Oxford, Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, but I'm not getting into any of the candidates at all. So first of all, in terms of modes of persuasion that a speaker trying to convince another will rely in rhetoric on logos in the bottom left, which is logic, reason, rationality. There's also pathos, appeals to emotion and sympathy and the imagination. And then at the top, ethos, credibility and reputation. And what I'm primarily focusing on in this rhetoric is how it emphasizes the ethos or credibility of the Shakespeare Academy and tries to denigrate and undermine and discredit the credibility of scholars who are questioning the attribution and proposing alternative candidates. So how is it that a figure like William Shakespeare, who is so foundational to global culture and about whom thick biographies are published every couple of years that end up on the bestseller list, how is it possible that this individual, that their identity could be in doubt? There are grounds for reasonable doubt. There are, in fact, no known records that connect Shakespeare of Stratford with literary activities of any kind. And there are also no known personal accounts of Shakespeare the writer that are known to exist. So nobody says, I had a mug of mead with Shakespeare the poet down at the Mermaid Tavern. There's nothing like that from the time. There's no letters to him or from him. And that the Elizabethan and Jacobean ages were rich in correspondence, but we have nothing. All literary references to Shakespeare, and there's about 70 of them from the time, are in name only. There's no biographical information at all. Even the first folio of 1623 has no biographical information about the supposed author. There are no known manuscripts in Shakespeare's own hand, and the plays and poems demonstrate vast knowledge. Shakespeare was clearly a classical Renaissance man. A vast degree of knowledge to which Shakespeare, the Stratford businessman, who apparently owned no books and never went to school, would have had no access, or at least we have no record of him going to school. Stratfordian scholars will say that during the lost years between 1585 and 1592, he must have been a legal clerk or a teacher or a soldier, and that's how he acquired his knowledge. There's also the miracle of genius, that he could just imagine everything that he wrote about, and that explains all his knowledge. And if the evidence is inadequate, well, that's because although the key documents are now lost. So there's these excuses that the scholars can make for him. So what I want to ask here is, what is the nature of the rhetoric and the scholarly practices used to defend the traditional belief and discredit those who question it? And are these rhetorics and practices indicative of a specific kind of belief system? And can that model of a belief system aid in understanding the doxastic roots or the belief-based roots in some instances of cancel culture? My theoretical framework here is virtue epistemology, which looks at the situatedness of knowers. And three aspects of it: epistemic vice is committed by actors acting in bad faith, so poor epistemic conduct, ignoring evidence, deliberately mischaracterizing the perspectives, the viewpoints of others, being arrogant and dogmatic. Epistemic injustice is then perpetrated on other knowers because they are prejudicially excluded. They are not believed, they are not listened to. And they then experience epistemic oppression by being persistently excluded from knowledge production. Now, I'm an academic librarian at the University of Winnipeg, and my analytical method is actually a pedagogical tool, the framework for information literacy for higher education, from the Association of College and Research Libraries, the oldest and largest division of the American Library Association. This is a tool that we academic librarians use with undergraduate students. It's a normative framework for understanding what constitutes sound scholarship, and it consists of 6 elements. The first is the idea that authority is constructed and contextual, that what constitutes expertise and common knowledge can change over time. This is the role of ethos. It looks at what exists in terms of authority, so that is ontological. The second frame is that information has value, and that institutions of higher learning, publishers, libraries will tend to lend value for certain views that become mainstream and widely represented, and certain other views may be marginalized by those structures. So this frame is axiological, it relates to values. The third is research is inquiry, that if our evidence seems paltry or unsatisfying, we then need to ask deeper and better, different questions, and not just excuse our lack of data. This frame is epistemological, being the study of what we know and how we know what we know, and also logos, rationality. Frame 4, information creation as a process. So depending on the audience, the intended audience of a work, that the information product may be a scholarly article, but it could just as easily be a documentary film or a book chapter. So this is a materialist frame. The fifth is searching as strategic exploration, that we need to be interdisciplinary. We need to look in as many possible places for information. This is methodological. And finally, that scholarship is conversation. This is intersubjectivity. We have an ethical obligation to listen to other scholars and to include them in the scholarly conversation, not to prejudicially exclude them. And this would be the role of pathos as well. So what I did then is I took these frames and I applied them to key examples of Stratfordian rhetoric and also scholarly practices, publishing practices, for ways to understand how this rhetoric works to suppress the authorship question, which has been around at least since 1847, and some would argue much earlier than that. But this rhetoric has become particularly intense in the last 40 years, and certainly in the last 20, and it's actively debated on social media. So frame 1, authority is constructed and contextual. Paul Edmondson with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust writes that the authorship question is, quote, a clash between the professional Shakespeare scholar and the anti-Shakespearean amateur. The former employs often highly specialized knowledge, the latter denies it. There is the loaded assumption that even though one may lack the necessary knowledge and expertise, it is always acceptable to challenge or contradict a knowledgeable and expert authority. It is not, unquote. So this passage is very characteristic of what we see in the literature, that it attempts to debunk skepticism about the tradition, that people like me are anti-Shakespearean, so that's very loaded rhetoric, that we deny history, and the denial part, not infrequently translates into accusations of being equivalent to Holocaust denial. That's a very significant part in the character assassination. But this idea then that they are the authorities and can't be questioned about this, and that anyone who does question the traditional biography is by definition not a scholar. Frame 2, information has value. In 2013, there were 2 books published with almost exactly the same title: Shakespeare Beyond Doubt from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which attempted to debunk the authorship question, published by Cambridge University Press, reviewed widely, and is in 326 libraries around the world. The Shakespeare Authorship Coalition is anti-Stratfordian and attempted to debunk the debunking with their book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Exposing an Industry in Denial, not picked up by a major publisher, and is now only in 33 libraries around the world. So this is a good demonstration of how structures of value in our institutions can lend credence and acceptance for certain views and not for others. The third frame, research as inquiry. Even Sir Stanley Wells with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust will admit that there is actually no documentary evidence linking Shakespeare of Stratford to the writing of the plays and poems. And yet the biography is considered to be beyond doubt, and questioning it is ridiculed or demonized. Some examples: that Joseph Rosenblum writes that no evidence for other candidates can exist, which is a fallacious statement because he's assuming a kind of godlike position where he's saying that this can't possibly exist, even though all things being equal, evidence should exist for an author. Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells again write that all alternative candidates are equally invalid. None has greater claim than the others. They're all equally false. Again, a fallacious statement. They're not looking or talking about each individual candidates. And one, the Earl of Oxford, 17th Earl of Oxford, has a great deal more support now, 100 years after he was identified, than Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe does at this point. So they're not equally supported in the literature.
Michael, you have 2 minutes.
Information creation as a process. In 2014, the edited collection, Shakespeare and the Digital World, discussed Shakespeare on the web, online courses, wikis, etc., with no mention made of the extensive material online about the authorship question, except for a passing reference to conspiracy hubs. And this is another frequent rhetorical tool, is trying to dismiss the authorship question as being a wacky conspiracy theory. Frame 5, searching and strategic exploration. Shakespeare Beyond Doubt and the Definitive Shakespeare Companion both had very little, completely ignored 60 years worth of authorship scholarship, and as if those works didn't exist. So very anemic sourcing, deliberately anemic. Frame 6, scholarship as conversation. There is extensive gatekeeping at Shakespeare journals to keep the authorship question away. In 2014, the Italian journal Memoria di Shakespeare was going to publish an article on the psychology of Stratfordianism by an Oxfordian author. And it was about to be published, and then an American editor, Gary Taylor, came on board, and he pulled the paper and compared it to Holocaust denial. And this made international news. You see, Inside Higher Ed had an article about it. Wikipedia as well has extensive and very strict control over the Shakespeare articles and won't let any kind of authorship content into those articles. So what does this indicate? I believe my analysis shows that authority is constructed and contextual demonstrates that leading Stratfordians depend almost entirely on ethos, their own, and undermining the ethos of others to defend the traditional biography of Shakespeare. Information has value reveals the extent to which current scholarly publishing practices tend to lend unwarranted value to the authority of Stratfordian voices at the expense of skeptics. Research as inquiry exposes Stratfordian biography as a closed circular system built around this ethos and pathos, incapable of asking necessary questions and addressing available evidence. Information creation as a process shows how these mechanisms of exclusion extend across all formats. Searching as strategic exploration demonstrates the willfully and deliberately anemic sourcing in leading authorship-related scholarship. And finally, scholarship as conversation depicts an academic community defending its ethos by refusing to engage in dialogue with post-Stratfordians. So what does this look like then, if as a belief system, as I believe
Michael, you're over time.
That we have a proposition that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was William Shakespeare, the writer, but there is no unequivocal historical documentary evidence to support this. So how is this argument buttressed rhetorically? There is a second order belief about the belief that it is a certainty beyond doubt and beyond questioning. There are a host of these explanatory beliefs, such as the lost years, the miracle of genius, key evidence being now lost, but these are based on faith, and these are justifying the proposition. There's a reflexive belief about the believers themselves that they are authoritative and cannot be questioned. An ethical belief that questioning the proposition is not just factually incorrect, but immoral, i.e. equivalent to Holocaust denial. And finally, a juridical belief that those who do question it may be justifiably punished, condemned, and excluded in institutions of scholarship. Now, when I set this out, I realized that it actually could be used as a template for understanding at least some incidents of cancel culture because this model is a juridical belief system, which I think can work across the political spectrum. That we have a propositional belief, whatever that may be, fill in the blank, a second order belief about it, that it's a certainty and can't be questioned. There's ideological or non-empirical explanatory beliefs justifying it, reflexive beliefs about the believers that they are on the right side of history and cannot be questioned, an ethical belief that questioning that proposition is immoral, and finally, the juridical belief that you can be justifiably punished and canceled. So what does this all imply? I believe that the authorship question and how it is being suppressed represents a significant but under-examined internal threat to academic freedom. It limits the thinkable and the sayable for everyone who cares about Shakespeare, including Stratfordians themselves, who have to police their own writing and pedagogy. It results in an impoverished and needlessly constrained discipline. And I believe it's an important case study in cancel culture because it's kind of paradigmatic. It's a scholarly and cultural taboo. Anti-Stratfordian voices and views are mischaracterized and misrepresented. They experience epistemic injustice. It is emotionally fraught, often fought online. The orthodox view is deeply institutionalized, but in its defense, partisans often commit epistemic vice. The orthodoxy is sustained by this juridical belief system that is, I think, quasi-religious in nature, that love of Shakespeare is bardolatry. So how can we bridge divides?
Michael, I think we need to stop, unfortunately, because we need to have some time for the presenters. I apologize.
Oh, sorry. I just want to let people know that I'm doing another talk 2 weeks from today at another conference, which is free, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Fall Symposium. I'm giving a different talk called Stratfordian Epistemology and the Ethics of Belief. Thank you. Excellent.
And feel free to send us your paper. So we would like to share it with our participants and read more about your wonderful, wonderful model. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Right, next we have Emmy, who is affiliated with the University of Kansas, but she'll be speaking from another cold place called Norway.
Thank you for having me. I love this conference. Thank you for all that you do, CARP team. And I love how everybody works together here. And in that spirit, this is a project in progress. And so I welcome feedback before I officially deploy it, since I haven't done that yet. So my project is called Canceling by Any Other Name. And I want to start by talking about the motivation for this study. And like most of you, or many of you, I assume, I got inspired by some of the arguments and posts that I was seeing in my own social media feeds anytime there was an instance of cancellation. And so the first kind of frame or thread that I would see is kind of summed by, there we go. This tweet here, which says, cancel culture in most cases is not about denying someone their voice. It is about recognizing and enacting consequences for the ways we use our voice. And so basically the idea that it's not cancel culture, it's consequence culture, or it's accountability, not cancellation. So that type of response was one that I was seeing frequently. And I was also seeing, and a lot of people, whenever conservatives would call out whatever they wanted, or whatever was being canceled, so whether that's Dr. Seuss or whatever, then people would bring up this point of the GOP or conservative leaders or elites have expressed discontent with a slew of brands, like explained in this tweet here, or individuals. And so the idea that that there's some hypocrisy there, that everyone cancels, but what if we only complain about cancellation when it's against something that we want? So those are the two kind of motivations. And so I decided to take the theoretical approach of framing, which fits well, of course. And there were three main studies that I relied on for my framing analysis. Of course, I cited many more, but the first is from Entman 93, and his discussion of the functions of framing are really important, I think, for a lot of cancel culture research, because he talks first about the way that frames help to identify problems, how they secondly help to establish causes of the problems. And this is the one that's particularly relevant for cancel culture. They offer moral judgments, which of course, moral panic is a part of cancel culture. And so that recognizing that function of frames helps us to better analyze them. And finally, of course, they suggest recommended solutions that are contained within the frames. The second theoretical approach framing study was the Jacoby 2000 study. He looked at the difference between general and specific frames. In this case, he looked at government spending. So if you just say there should be more or less government spending, that leads to different conclusions than looking at specific allotments for government spending. So changing between a general and a specific frame can lead to individualized opinion change. So the frame matters. And there's a lot of framing research that can be kind of nebulous, and is it really having the effect we think? And so that's why I love this Nelson and Oxley study from '99, which looks at, they used causal analysis to isolate framing effects and note that they are independently affecting both belief content and belief importance. So what we believe, and then the level of importance that belief has for us, and that both content and belief importance contribute to issue opinion. So the frame really does matter. As for previous findings on cancel culture research in particular, this is an emerging field, of course, and there's a lot of great qualitative work, but there's not that much quantitative work, particularly focused on like public opinion and those sorts of things. So actually, if you watch the keynote address, some of these graphs are going to be similar to, the exact ones you saw, because some of the best quantitative research on this is coming out of Pew. So first conclusion from existing research from Pew: most Americans associate cancel culture with accountability, but there are partisan differences. And this was discussed during the keynote address. So the majority associated with accountability, but of course, liberals are more likely to view it that way than conservatives. And similarly, people who are more liberal think that it's holding people accountable, whereas people who are more conservative view it as undue punishment. Second finding from Pew Research is that the majority of Americans think others are too easily offended by what people say. So that's online here. And we saw this, I think, in the keynote address too. And so this has been a shift. So since a few years ago, liberals are now more likely to say that we are not taking the offensive content online as seriously as we should, whereas conservatives say we take it way too seriously. And then offline, the similar thing. If you look at the US here, the US people think that, or respondents think that we're too easily offended. So they're kind of contradictory findings in that people associate it with accountability, but then they also think that we take offensive content too seriously. So those are kind of contrasting. So there's a puzzle there. And then there were a couple studies outside of Pew that I did also really rely on for the quantitative research. So supporting for cancellation is situational. So this study that just came out from Vahi Roberts and Yudish, I don't know how to say that, they found that they used framing analysis as well. And sorry, that's my cat's tail. And they found that free speech, if they use the frame that free speech restrictions are because of cancellation culture, that does not increase support for free speech among Republicans as they might have expected. And additionally, that when Democratic groups or left-wing groups use the cancel culture frame, support for free speech among Republicans, so Republicans, the decreases. So Republicans are less supportive of free speech rights for those Democratic groups that are using that frame. And final one, people who want to cancel, who are generally women and liberal, they want an apology and they want to look at deeper characteristics, which is important for character assassination research. And they're also looking at a consensus for moral behavior. This is a really cool study that did this tree analysis, and it also just came out fairly recently. Okay, so all of that led to my 4 main research questions. The first one is, sorry, my cat is playing with the thing there. She was not doing this the whole time before the conference. Okay, does the level of general support for cancellation differ from that for a specific case? So when we use the general versus the specific, because most of the research, including Pew, is really only looking at the general, are you in support of cancel culture? And then is more support given for a case of cancellation when framed as cancel culture versus consequence culture? And I'll explain how I measure that. And then do partisans express more support for a case of cancellation when the target group is from their political in-group than when it's their political out-group? Finally, do people view attempts to cancel as character assassination? So that's obviously why it's most relevant for this conference and kind of actually addresses some of the questions that were raised in the first panel today. So here's the method that I established. So first, start with some demographic and psychographic questions. I'll return to that at the end because some of them are relevant for future research. And then the main crux of this was to first ask about cancel culture in general. And I put together a battery of questions that are based on research that I read, but also real life comments that I was seeing. And so I put together this, that if you have any suggestions on this, this is my battery of questions that I have for this. Obviously it's in a matrix. And so there's also several reverse coded items here. So cancel culture is ruining America. Cancel culture is more of a political talking point than actual problem. Canceling is just a way of attacking an innocent person you disagree with. It's threatening free speech. People deserve cancellation and the consequences. It's a way to show that we don't accept racism, sexism, etc. And then I feel that I could be a victim of cancel culture. So as this is a study in progress, I don't have my data yet, but if you have suggestions before I run this, I'd love to hear them, but I'm also very curious to see if this is a statistically valid set of questions. So that's the general one. And then the case, so to look at a specific instance, and I think this is pretty novel within the research at this point. I'm going to go into more depth about that. So here's the stimulus. So first they'll get a news article, a fake news article, obviously, that says that this local city council member, so they'll either get a Republican, a Democrat, or nonpartisan person, depending on what condition they're put into, randomly selected. They will be told that that person asked women in his office if they had taken nude pictures and if he could see those nude pictures. And the reason I picked this is because this is I'm taking like the verbatim things that the Jeopardy host that recently resigned his position over these comments. These are the actual things that he said, but I feel like a lot of people were aware of that case, but don't know the exact words. So it's a good way to have ecological validity because it's something that really happened, but it's kind of not known enough that people will maybe make that connection. So just shifting that to this political context. And then they'll be shown tweets that call for him to either be held accountable, so like calling for him to be fired or to step down, but one with the accountability frame and one with the cancellation frame. So once they get the two stimuli, the news article and then the tweets, then they will be asked a series of questions. The first is the level of agreement and favorability regarding those tweets. So do they agree that he should be canceled or face accountability? The second one is a feeling thermometer regarding that politician. So that allows me to look at, okay, if it's the accountability frame, are they less favorable of him? Whereas if canceled, does that make people like him less? We'll see. And then what are their desired outcomes? Because previous research has shown that people want an apology first. So is that all they want? That'll be interesting to find. And then finally, the methods of character assassination. So earlier on the first panel, the question was raised of like, how do cancel culture and character assassination merge? And so this is a way to, I didn't ask it as, do you think this is character assassination? I used the methods of character assassination that the CARP team has come up with and said, do you think that these tweets count as this? So it's a way to see how people are evaluating that. And then we can see if people think that it's character assassination, but also if they are still in favor of the retribution of the consequences.
Amy,
So
2 minutes.
Character assassination for bad necessarily. Okay, so future research, then there are obviously several limitations to this study because anytime you're doing quantitative research, the case you choose is going to be very restrictive. But I have some future research avenues contained within this project. So I mentioned the psychographics at the beginning. So I have a question between the demographics and the main stimuli as like a sort of distraction question. And that's a media consumption question. So I'll be able to see if you watch Tucker Carlson, are you more in favor of, or are you less in favor of cancel culture? Yeah. Or does that change? And I can also obviously do path analysis to see if there's indirect effects mediated by media consumption. Also, I have prejudice in there as both racial and gender prejudice to see if those are affecting the way that people are responding to this, especially because this case is a sexual harassment case. And then I have polarization measures in there too, to see if more polarized people have different outcomes on any of these measures. And then other studies that could do related things. So obviously doing different cases would be really nice. And then the accountability frames in the tweets that I show, they're just, this person should be held accountable, this person should be canceled, but having people use the accountability frame with the negative. So to say, there's nothing here to cancel, or there's nothing here to be held accountable for, that could be interesting. And then obviously figuring out a way to also include the target's response. So if they apologize, is that good enough? Or what are we wanting? So that would be an extension of my research question about like, what do people want from these people? Which I think a lot of us have that question. So that should be right on time. So I look forward to hearing your questions and your suggestions. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. Wonderful. So we'll look forward to your study and hopefully we can share some of the ideas in the chat. Finally, we have Leslie Reynard from Kansas, right, as well. So she'll be talking about shaming to death, the fatal institutional cancellations of professors Shiveley and Adams. And that's Leslie's third conference with CARP. She came in 2017 and 19, and she's been with us on the journey for a long time. So thanks for being our friend and supporter all these years.
Oh, I appreciate this conference, the work you're doing, all the participants and every other thing about it. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, all right. All right, so my focus is on what happens when an institutionally facilitated cancellation campaign occurs, and the fact that these can literally be fatal to the target. It's not, okay. So the focus here is going to be termed academic mobbing, which is a form of character assassination, workplace bullying, and so forth. The presentation today is part of a longer paper I'm developing that may actually be a book or 2 books. Serge, you know how I am. But the larger paper includes a focus on public degradation rituals as a form of really lethal reputational politics. The peer participation that's required for that type of character assassination, and ways that colleagues can be transformed into a mob, which is now a global phenomenon, has been for many years, but it's being recognized now that it's a serious issue across the globe in workplaces. In some areas of the, it'll be a book, I'm going to talk about the social, political, and legal processes involved in trying to counter this tendency of institutions and organizations in terms of counter mobbing or reputational reclamation strategies. The 2 fatally targeted and mobbed professors I want to talk about today as case studies are Dr. Michael J. Shiveley, who was a well-known, renowned professor of anatomy and veterinary medicine at Utah Valley University, and Dr. Mike Adams, who was a criminal justice professor, sociologist at University of North Carolina in Wilmington. Both of these men were targeted and mobbed in it's now being called in the literature academic downward mobbing, which means it's not, the source is institutional, it's up in the leadership and administrative hierarchy, and there are strategic institutional goals that ridding oneself of professors like these can accomplish by unleashing a mob on them. I kind of see it as analogous to those old Western movies where everybody in the bar is mad at somebody and decides to go out and lynch the person, and the corrupt sheriff goes, wait, let me deputize you. And then they stop being a lynch mob and they become a posse. And so that's kind of what I'm seeing happening to these people. These are examples of hundreds or thousands of people who have this experience in their workplaces, especially in higher education and medicine, thought workers, scientists, knowledge workers, driven literally to suicide. Michael Shiveley committed suicide in August of 2019, and Mike Adams committed suicide in July of 2020. I have a lot of links embedded here because I know I can't get to all of these, but I'm willing to share my bibliography in this PowerPoint with anyone who's interested in this. But there are websites set up in the United States, US grassroots movement to try to promote this healthy workplace bill that's going to legislate and possibly criminalize some of these behaviors, which I'll mention later. They probably need to be criminalized so that people will have some sort of way to get around 11th Amendment immunity, or trying to identify tenure or a job as a property interest, which gets these cases kicked out of court too often. It's very well known that employee suicide is certainly a possible, if not a likely, outcome of these sorts of mobbing behaviors. And this site especially, Dr. Kenneth Westhughes, I'm going to open this one. This is a very, very well-developed site that's been in place for a good 20 years. Dr. Westhughes is a Canadian scholar, University of Waterloo, who was one of the early theorists and students of this type of mob or group behavior. He has written several books that are based on his own experience of being mobbed in the 1990s, the mid 1990s. And so let me see if I can get out of this now. Let me get back to my PowerPoint. That's interesting. Let's see if I can get there from here. Yeah, okay, we're back. One of his books is called Eliminating Professors, called A Guide to the Dismissal Process. And early on, I bought mine used on Amazon, and the person who owned it originally, her name's in the front with her 2 phone numbers, Human Resources. And from her underlying, I can see that she thought it really was a guide for administrators to dismiss tenured professors. So kind of interesting. And then the other one is Envy of Excellence, which develops a thesis that's repeated in a lot of these case studies that I've come across, that the mobbing targets are often at the apex of their departmental or institutional teaching, research, and service pyramids. The Eliminating Professors text provides a 5-stage discussion, which has proven across time, of the phases that these mobbing practices take. The first 2 stages are ostracization and harassment. And then the stage 3 is an incident, the incident, which is used by the administrators as the rationale for stages 4 and 5, which are the aftermath, which is an investigation and a collection of charges, often untrue, used to justify the dismissal or mobbing or elimination of the targeted person. And stage 5 is the elimination. Layman LIPT is the layman inventory of psychological terror that is often at the center of workplace mobbing. There are 45 indices, and this was collected throughout the 70s and 80s. And once they had these 45, they stopped collecting the data because it seemed like they had exhausted every route to inflicting terror on workplace employees that they needed. And so they're still using this LIPT measure, and it seems to be accurate and relevant. And furthermore, it has been modified for international applications, and that too seems to be reliable and accurate as a measure. This is from the preface of Dr. Weshue's book on eliminating professors. My thesis from the research I've done so far, and from all the international case studies I've read, and from looking at the typologies and the instruments and the research methods, is that there's strong proof to develop an opinion that institutions are fully aware of this growing problem and its likely outcome for targeted faculty. They benefit from their employees carrying out mobbing activities. Think of Munchausen's by proxy at the institutional level, and recent statistics that about 2/3 of those in the United States who raise issues with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or similar agencies are terminated from their employment. Institutions know full well, or they could know, that targets experience clearly related health consequences from being subjected to mobbing activities in their workplaces, including physical and mental disorders that frequently lead to suicide. And there is a defined and predictable pattern of phases that take place in mobbing activities in academia.
Leslie, 5 minutes.
Okay, then I will move much faster. See if I can get this to move. Okay, Dr. Mike Adams was a respected professor at UNC Wilmington. He was a conservative spokesperson. He wrote this interesting post, "Get out of my class and leave America," to people that wanted to be slackers in the university. He was involved in a lawsuit with UNC Wilmington for 7 years, which he won. He wrote a book about it. And then he was mobbed by his students in 2020 because they didn't like his tweets, which, you know, they were pretty extreme. He settled with the university, which had been forced to hire him and give him tenure and pay him back wages. He settled with them for $500,000 to retire on August 1st. but he killed himself on July 27th. In Dr. Shiveley's case, he was accused by his students, a mob of students, of writing tests that were too hard. And he taught anatomy to pre-med students, so their tests probably should have been hard, but he really took it to heart in a horrific way, felt that it was all his fault, and that he thought he could do better by writing easier tests. That didn't do him any good. He was subjected to an investigation, an internal investigation. I would recommend this paper that was just published to you. It's by Peter McGuire, The Red Queen's Rules, talking about an anti-Socratic shift in American education, where universities are competing for customers, which we could call tuition delivery units rather than students, because they are being pushed through some institutions with no need to pass tests like Dr. Shiveley's, or even take required courses in order to allow the institution to meet its mandates for recruitment, retention, and completion. He was found guilty of these complaints that were just weird, because this one student, one professor, Sarah Flood, who he'd helped with her visa and tenure, wanted to be the chair of the anatomy department. So a number of her students joined together to mob him with the president of the university. It turns out student one was her nephew. He was found, this is the person who instigated the mobbing. And then he was released from his job, his tenure. He did not survive it. He committed suicide on August 19th, 2019. And his family has filed a suit against Utah Valley University. Just this past Monday, their attorneys argued their appeal in front of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, hoping that he'll be able to achieve some justice because of the unfounded complaints that caused him to commit suicide. That probably won't be determined until October or November. What's interesting is their attorney only had 15 minutes to present his case too. So mine is nowhere near as important.
Leslie, 1 minute.
Okay, so this is a note that one of his students wrote to him. His case has triggered an extreme amount of outrage among people who have heard about it. His is just one of many cases of academic mobbing and downward administrative mobbing. In many cases, men who are more invested in their careers and their reputations as professionals are more affected by this sort of stigmatizing and ostracization and commit suicide. Women suffer the same thing too, but in many cases we're kind of used to disrespect, so it can kind of roll off our backs. And also our identity is not involved as deeply in our careers as Dr. Shiveley and Adams and others are. And you have possibly other routes that you can take, your portable skill sets that you've developed as a professor. And if you'd like a copy of my bibliography or this PowerPoint, or to talk about academic mobbing or to request more information, please contact me at my Center for Applied Communication Research, because in full disclosure, I myself am in midpoint of being mobbed away from my tenure. Wanted to leave for 6 years, but that's all right. We couldn't do it my way, we'll do it their way. But applied communication research and publicizing this sort of toxic workplace environment, which is worldwide, is probably more important than giving easy tests, in my opinion.
Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate your presentation. I know it's been very difficult issue to talk about, and it's a very sensitive subject. So we have about less than 10 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to ask your questions. I guess the first question came from Irina, and this is a question for everyone. So, are there any independent efforts not affiliated with any faction, camp, tribe to investigate the argument on the both sides? Is there a democratization of the academic discussion due to self-publishing processes and growing public interest in popular and independent work? I guess that question was for Michael originally.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, please.
So I'm going to post it right here again in the chat so you can see it again.
Thank you.
And Irina, feel free to rephrase the question if I didn't ask it right.
No, that was fine. I just wanted to basically see if, besides these two warring factions, whether there were any independent academic or non-academic academics who could bypass this whole situation from some independent route.
So I guess, in other words, is there any way to be unbiased and not to be caught in any ideological or partisanship struggle when it comes to your presentation?
Yeah, in the case of the authorship debate, there is an organization, the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, that just wants to, like, they posted an online petition, something for reasonable doubt. Like they just want to be able to have a conversation. They want to have a debate. They've put up money to say, let's have a debate, and the winners get, $40,000 to a charity of your choice. But the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, they don't want to have a debate about it because they just keep saying it's ridiculous. And the Authorship Coalition isn't promoting any particular candidate. They just want to have a debate about it, as an example. So having some kind of third-party organization who are interested in the issue can be one way to address it. You're right.
Thank you, Michael. So I have a comment from Rod to Amy about her research. Amy, I just posted here again in the group chat. So, I mean, he has a suggestion of how your future study could go. And I wonder also, I'm really interested in your design, and I find it extremely complicated and sophisticated. And I really look forward to what you find with all of your data crunching. So yeah, good luck with that.
Thank you. And that's an excellent suggestion. I think it's very interesting to assess, the recency of the offense. And I'm very interested in that as well.
So I have a question for Leslie. Leslie, you did a lot of research trying to see how professors and people working in academia can defend themselves against character assassination. Is there much legal protection available? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, no, I'd have to say no. And I'd like to also respond to Rod Carveth's comment about Mike Adams. And I agree, those are things I would not, a lot of his things are things that I would never have posted, but he still had a First Amendment right to post those as an individual, although he did pull his students into it. At any rate, he won in court, which I guess says something, which is kind of unusual that anyone would win in court or even get to court because of the 11th Amendment immunity for government and qualified immunity for governments to be sued. A lot of these cases I've read and that are in my bibliography, the charges were not true. They were lies, and they were proven to be lies. And the thing is that even if you would sue somebody for defamation anymore, I think I addressed this in our last conference when we were talking about the troll farm and online defamation, these anti-SLAPP suits, which are strategic litigation against public participation, prevent people to some extent from filing defamation suits against others. You have to prove that you're an individual suing another individual. Otherwise, you get to pay their attorney's fees and sanctions if they file a motion to dismiss. In Kansas, anyway, it's got a very strong anti-SLAPP law, but Kansas also has a very strong, one of the few criminal defamation laws. So I don't know. I think what's really important is if there were a recognition of the connection between mind and body in every state. Workman's compensation laws, for example, in Kansas, don't notice that. They don't think that there is. And so you can't bring a workman's comp claim for mental distress or PTSD or anything like that. In Missouri, though, yeah, very friendly to that type of a plaintiff. There needs to be some consistency, probably need to criminalize these deliberate behaviors. There's civil conspiracy laws that might work, but still you have to hire an attorney. And the EEOC stats from 2019, I think, show hundreds of thousands of inquiries that went to formal charges, and something like 3% of them were brought to court by the EEOC. And private attorneys cost a lot of money and generally don't want to take anything but a slam dunk case like that on a contingency basis. Most people really don't have access to justice for this type of workplace experience.
I need to take a minute to respond here, because I think what's happening, Leslie, is that you're conflating the lawsuit that Mike Adams filed against UNC Wilmington with all the other stuff that has gone on in terms of his writing and complaint. The lawsuit was an employment lawsuit over the fact that he was denied promotion to full professor. And he was denied promotion for full professor because the tenure and promotion committee at UNC Wilmington screwed up. They, in assessing his record, they went beyond assessing his record in terms of the classroom and his scholarship. Adams wanted his writings in townhall.com and so forth to be part of his record. What ended up happening is that the comments that were being made were, political comments. They battled that out in the court over 7 years. He finally, won his case. Had the tenure and promotion committee not said anything about the political nature of his writings, then he wouldn't have won that lawsuit. So that is a separate thing. And it's an important part of employment law now. But all of the other hookah-pooka that he ended up engaging in, including, it's not, they're not lies. There are students who were referenced in his town hall columns that really were clearly defamatory. That's beyond the bounds of being an appropriate academic. He brought a lot of it on his own. He actually was the one that told, the board of trustees asked him what he wanted. He said, look, I'm thinking about retiring in 5 years. How about you pay me now? They did. He obviously had other demons that were bothering him. I don't see that this academic mobbing ended up in his, in his suicide. And quite frankly, academe is much better off without him.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with any of that. I'm just focusing on the fact that the mobbing was lethal. There was a large group of students, I think there are like 5,900 signatures on a change.org petition in 2020 to remove him. I'm not talking about that. I don't agree with his behavior at all. I'm just talking about his outcome and Dr. Shiveley's and too many other people. They don't survive this sort of workplace activity. And of course, not all of them are in the right, but I think Dr. Shiveley was.
Well,
Yes.
I will agree with Dr. Shiveley. He got screwed.
Okay.
Adams,
So unfortunately, I have to interfere. So our time is officially over. So we have to move on. One thing to just add here, we also have to consider different kind of legal kind of restrictions in different states. And the United States legal system is extremely difficult to understand, especially when comparing different states and their laws. So, but thank you all participants, panelists, for this wonderful discussion, and please continue discussing the issues talked about in this panel in the chat box.